What do you mean here?
Our government has been focusing so much on image, on how the country looks like. Look at the nice tall buildings we have. Look at the convention center that has cost over $600 million. So they had been more. They had been investing more in perception because they have so much to hide.
Is there any country or anybody would not want to see clean streets, good buildings in town? I think it's an achievement that most people would be proud of.
I think what is needed first is the well-being of Rwandans. And I don't see how these hotels and these nice tall buildings can affect Rwandan lives.
Hello family, it's African Esquire and welcome to the Federation of African Liberation. Today I'm going to talk to you about an issue that's going on in Kenya, and that is the imprisonment of the former presidential candidate Diane Rwigara. So if you haven't heard, recently this story has resurfaced, as many of you might have heard, of the imprisonment of Bobi Wine, who was also a presidential candidate inside of Uganda, who was arrested and believed to be arrested on false charges because he stood as a potential presidential candidate to the Rwandan dictator. So this time in Rwanda, it's been revealed that a similar situation happened that people kind of brushed under the rug and no one was really paying attention to, and that was the arrest of presidential candidate Diane Rwigara. So I'm going to just read a quick news clip from Citizen TV, and it says Diane Rwigara is a former presidential hopeful and women's rights activist who is currently in prison outside of Kigali awaiting trial. The 37-year-old accountant, a fierce critic of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, launched her election bid 3 months ahead of the August 2017 vote. She was Kagame's sole female challenger in the poll, but her campaign was short-lived. Electoral authorities disqualified her, claiming she doctored the number of signatures needed to qualify and accusing her of submitting the names of dead people, which she denied. With her presidential bid over, Diane Rwigara launched the People's Salvation Movement, an activist group to encourage Rwandans to hold their own government accountable. Shortly after its inception, she was arrested on charges of incitement and fraud, which her family and supporters say are politically motivated. Just to give some more context to the story, Diane is actually the child of a former politician inside of Rwanda who was actually killed inside of a car accident, and it is her belief and her family's belief that he was actually killed in a political assassination. Whenever she first started running for president, the Kenyan government started trying to do different things to silence her, including posting nude photos of her. Now, she later revealed that these photos were not actually of her. They were completely doctored. But, of course, this is how you start your candidacy, is a deliberate attempt to completely derail her ability to be able to become a presidential candidate. Today, this woman is in jail just because she wanted to do something for her country, just because she wanted to run for presidency. Technically, anyone's supposed to be allowed to run for presidency inside of Rwanda. However, anytime people go to run for presidency against Paul Kagame, who has been a dictator in Rwanda for over 20 years, anytime they stand up to actually run for the presidency, these people get silenced. A lot of these people disappear. Now, it's interesting and relevant to remember that Paul Kagame is one of the best friends of many American presidents. In fact, him and Hillary Clinton were really tight. He was cool with Obama. He is seen as, and Bill Clinton was also really cool with him, and he is seen as the African leader who is besties with the United States. And of course, you're going to be besties with the United States as long as you contribute to the interest of the United States. I always laugh at how the U.S. has so many friendships with these dictators who oppress their people, and right now we're just talking about on people on the African continent. Most of these leaders are neo-colonial puppets, and they are actually oppressing their people, and the U.S. has so many friendships with these people. However, when it comes to a country like Cuba, which was ruled by Fidel Castro and now is being ruled by his brother, because this country is a socialist country, despite the fact that hardly any of the human rights committed by Fidel Castro amounts to anything close to people like Paul Biya or Kagame. It's far less human rights violations in that country, yet because it's a socialist country in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba gets to be labeled as an enemy of the United States. Same thing with Zimbabwe. Whenever Mugabe was actually in power, it was because he was the one who said that the white farmers had to leave Zimbabwe and we're not going to give you compensation. You just have to leave because you weren't here originally and you took the land from our ancestors. Therefore, we're going to start over without you having control of the lands. Because he was willing to do that, he became an enemy of the United States. So it's really funny when you see people pick and choose who's a human rights violator, who's not, who gets to be counted and who doesn't, how the United States gets to call people human rights violators whenever the United States has the largest prison population in the world, when the United States is one of the few Western countries or few developed countries that still has the death penalty. Yeah, the United States gets to be the one who chooses who is not and who is a dictator, who is a human rights violator, and they get to represent that to the public. And the public, of course, they follow suit and say, oh, Fidel Castro, he was a horrible person, despite the fact that he made sure that his whole country had free education, despite the fact that his whole country had free health care, despite the fact that the literacy of Cuba is higher than many developed countries, including the United States. Despite all of these things, he gets to be painted as a dictator, whereas you got people like Kagame, who has killed hundreds of thousands of people. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit right now. This man has killed hundreds of thousands of people since he's gotten to be the president of Kenya, yet the United States has turned a blind eye to him and has maintained a relationship with him. And that shows you that the issue is not about human rights. The issue is about self-preservation, and the issue is about the issue is about maintaining your interests on the continent and not about being a voice for human rights. Human rights is always going to be used whenever you don't want to support a regime, or where you do want to support overthrowing the regime. That's whenever human rights becomes an issue. However, as long as you're maintaining the Western interests, then you are untouchable and you will not be called out for your horrible violations inside of the human rights sphere. So Kagame is very interesting. So many of you might have known of the Rwanda genocide. It was a genocide where over 300 Tutsis were murdered by the Hutu. And, I'm sorry, not 300. Over 800,000 Tutsis were murdered by the Hutu. Now, Kagame is a Hutu, and, Kagame is a Tutsi, and the Tutsi were the minority, whereas the Hutu were the majority. So, after basically the genocide ended, the Hutu, who were no longer in power, and the Tutsis, who were now in power, it basically became a reverse genocide. So now you had the Tutsis, who were the minority as far as population, going out and killing the Hutu, and Kagame was really the leader of that movement. In fact, whenever a lot of Hutu, and a lot of these were people who were innocent, they had nothing to do with the genocide, they were just happened to be Hutu just because of their ethnic origin, they fled into the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But Kagame went in after these people and committed genocide against them, killing about over 300,000 Hutu. So it's really someone who's committing just as many human rights catastrophes as was done during the Rwanda genocide. However, because he's doing so with these reasons, such as we're going to get the terrorists, or we're going to make sure that Rwanda is stable, but really it just looks like acts of revenge. But because he can say these things under the guise of he's doing something for the people, or doing something that are going to promote the interest of Rwanda, he's been allowed to basically slide with doing these horrible things to people, these mass murders to people, women, children, old, elderly. He's been allowed to slide with doing these things. Now, the other interesting thing that we have to keep in mind about the situation inside of Rwanda is that Rwanda right now is considered to be one of the most developed countries in Africa. In fact, it's known to have made a complete turnaround. You'll hear people say that Rwanda has these beautiful buildings, the streets in Rwanda are completely clean, and therefore Kagame is doing good things for Rwanda. Of course, if you know that, first of all, not all the people are benefiting from these clean streets and these nice buildings, and that's the same thing as what happens anywhere, wherever you have these nice, developed, urbanized areas. You're going to see these beautiful buildings, but that does not necessarily mean that the people who need the the capital from those types of investments are going to get them. I see this all the time in the United States. You'll have beautiful places. Chicago to me is the biggest example. When I was in Chicago for a year, it's a beautiful city, clean city, amazing, gorgeous city as far as when you're in the downtown area. However, go down south to South Chicago, you're going to see a whole nother situation. So how come this beautiful city with this huge architecture, all these businesses, all of this capital flowing through the city, how is it that this is supposed to benefit the city, but the people who live below a certain line and a certain location inside of Chicago actually do not receive any of the benefits of all this beauty, of all this investment, of all this capital gain? And it's the same thing that's happening in Rwanda. You might have these beautiful images of this beautiful city, but that's not necessarily trickling down. And that's why trickle-down economics is a complete lie. Unless you're having the people who are ruling the corporations, then no, the money will not trickle down to them. In fact, it will only trickle to the people who are on top, the people who are the ones making the shots inside of the corporations, and it will almost never trickle down to the people who are actually most in need of funds. Now, I want to distinguish I want to talk broadly about Africa and why is it that this keeps happening as far as these corrupt leaders, these corrupt dictators who are able to hold power while they are giving the image of being pro-Africa, pro their country, but at the same time they're really not doing anything for their country. They're instead under the guise of democracy. Now we're going to talk about the United States for a second. In the U.S., there is a guise of democracy, and a lot of people know as we track bills in the Senate and inside of the House of Representatives that the people are not actually the ones who are putting the agenda on a referendum inside of these political entities. So they'll debate things, they'll argue things, and they'll pass bills, but most of these bills are benefiting Wall Street. Most of these bills are benefiting the top 1%, the mighty corporations that have nothing to do with the vast majority of Americans. And this is what you might call an oligarchy, meaning there's a few people who rule the whole country, or you might call it corporatocracy, meaning the corporations in the countries are actually the ones that rule the whole country. Now in the United States, these types of political entities or this type of political setup is allowed to exist under the guise of democracy. So technically, the people can vote. Technically, they can vote for who they want to vote for. However, if you don't have the corporate backing of these multi-million, billionaire companies, then you're really not going to be seen by the public. No one's going to know who you are. You're not going to be a voice that gets heard. So really, it's them who get to choose. They chose the President Obama way before most of us know who he was. As soon as they seen that they could manipulate him and make him do what they want him to do, all of a sudden we see on the national spotlight this guy named Obama. As soon as you see any type of leader who can do what the corporations want to get done, you're going to see those people who are promoted in the news instead of the people who might only represent the interest of the majority of the population. Now, you always have exceptions to this rule, of course, because if you have the ability to build a platform absent any corporate donation, someone like Bernie Sanders, then you might be able to get on the national stage. However, you have to note that Bernie Sanders has been active in the political sphere for a long time, building up a grassroots movement for himself, and so that takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more effort. However, if you're looking for fast track political candidacy, then you're going to appeal to the corporatocracy. You're going to appeal to the elite. Why am I breaking this down for talking about Africa? The same exact thing exists on the African continent. However, instead of it being local corporations, it's actually national corporations, and this is why. While I definitely am, I'm fond of the idea of democracy, I'm not blind to the fact that democracy, if it's not done at a proper time with a proper setup, it really just becomes a guise to promote the corporatocracy. And because the corporatocracy existed prior to the decolonization of a lot of African countries, the corporations were able to maintain their interest in these countries. So anytime that you see a new country that's actually independent, you should be very suspecting of the fact that so many outside corporations are existing inside of this country that's supposed to be independent. In fact, if the majority of your corporations are from people outside of the country, outside of the continent, then who are the ones that are going to be driving the agendas? Who are the ones that are going to be driving politicians? In a lot of African countries, they not only allow foreign companies to come and take the predominant part of their economies, but they also allow for these foreign companies a lot of times to stay without having to pay taxes. So not only this doesn't trickle down to the people at all, because these people are coming and they're having their corporations inside of some countries and they're not even paying taxes for it, meaning that money just goes back to those people inside from whatever corporation that they work for. So let's say it's a corporation in China, the money just goes right back to China, and the only people that get paid from it are the people who make deals with the corporation. And a lot of times that will be a president or a prime minister who made some type of deal with the corporation for the corporation to come into the country in the first place. Rarely do you see that money actually get dispersed to the people. So there always has to be economic stability before you have political stability. This idea that you can just go right into democracy, okay, we're democratic now, okay, let's do this, but you don't have an economy that's built on equality, you don't have an economy that's actually built on the benefit of the people, then that's very easily going to get corrupted. You have to remember, democracy was deliberately chosen in a lot of instances, because if you do have the ability to have an economy that benefits some people, you can completely guise democracy as being this, as you could completely guise oligarchy as being democracy. So you always have to be questioning of whenever you have people talking about free and fair elections, but the economy is not driven by the people. And really, if the economy is not driven by the people, then you're not going to have any freedom. You're not going. That's really what freedom is. Freedom is power. Power is economic. Being able to move money, being able to move economics. If you're not able to do these things, then your freedom is really just symbolic. It's not actual. So until the African people actually have a part inside of corporations, inside of their land, inside of these mines that are run by outside foreign companies, then you're never going to have the ability to actually say that you're truly free and truly democratic. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from an article by Diane Rwigara, who's the Minister of Information of the Federation of African Liberation, before I close out. So this is an article that he entitled "The Colonial Nature of African Dictatorships." Now, the article ends out as him saying, "Many have described the present-day political situation in Africa as neo-colonialism because despite being political independent, the same colonial structures exist in which Western countries profit from the exploitation of Africa's resources and Africa's people. This is why Kwame Nkrumah wrote, Neocolonialism is the worst form of imperialism. For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility, and for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. In the days of old-fashioned colonialism, the imperial powers had at least to explain and justify at home the actions it takes abroad. In the colony, those who served the ruling imperial power could at least look to its protection against any violent move by their opponents. With neocolonialism, neither is the case. It is for this reason that the struggle against dictatorships and poor governance in Africa is a struggle against one of the last remaining vestiges of colonial rule. Many have fought and died to achieve political independence from its former colonizers, but the struggle still remains an unfinished one as long as the neocolonialism leadership remains in power in Africa. And as long as this is the setup to where you can have people like Kagame, who seems to be doing the right things for its country on its face, but in actuality he's serving the interest of a neo-colonial power, then you're going to have instances where activists or people who are just trying to run for presidency in their countries are going to be arrested and going to be jailed, like people like Diane Rwigara. So I say all this to say that we really have to take a serious look at what we consider liberation as far as economics, as far as who can have a part in our country. Every time that I believe it was It might have been, it was one African country, I forget which one. There was a referendum to basically mandate that any corporation that was built inside of this country had to at least be 50% African owned, or owned by the people inside of the country. And quickly, once this referendum got put, the neo-colonialists got word of this referendum, they completely bombarded it, and the referendum ended up not going through, despite the fact that this would have benefited African people. So we have to keep in mind that if we're not considering things like this, considering the ownership of these corporations, whether or not having this ownership, we can actually be free of these corporations. Not having ownership of our minds, not having ownership of the natural resources that are in our continent. If we do not have control or even some type of democratic say in the economic portion of the government, we have to realize that we have no control or no say inside of the political arena inside of our governments. So I say all this to say, we have to start drifting away from this idea of democracy being the saving grace and drifting towards the idea of economic democracy, the people deciding what happens with their natural resources. Otherwise, you're always going to be subjected to outside imperialist forces who want to subject you to their interests instead of your own interest at home. So that's all I have. I will see you all in another video.